The UK's Health Minister Matt Hancock has announced that anyone returning from Wuhan will be safely isolated for 14 days with all necessary medical attention. People will be kept at military bases for 2 weeks. Now, we're staying with this story. As we know, British Airways has suspended flights to and from mainland China as the outbreak of coronavirus disrupts travel across the region. The airline said the decision follows advice that British nationals should avoid all but essential travel to China due to the spread of the virus, which has now killed more than 130 people. Eoghan Corry, editor of Travel Extra, is on the line. Eoghan, that's a big move from British Airways. Do you think other airlines will follow suit?
It's hard to tell at this stage. British Airways have two routes. They have a Beijing and a Shanghai route. They suspended both of them in response to, as you say, the English Department of Foreign Affairs elevating the level of risk for China as a whole. The other airlines have been slower to suspend. When incidents like that happen, they don't all follow like dominoes. And the Heathrow routes would not be enormously significant for Irish people going to China. A lot of our passengers go through Istanbul, the Middle East and Helsinki. They seem to be holding firm, and I don't expect suspensions by those airlines.
And how much are British Airways likely to be losing by cancelling these flights?
Not a lot. This is a time of the year when airlines lose a lot of money. China's been a little bit tricky for British Airways. They started a Chengdu route a couple of years ago, have cancelled it very quickly and moved the aircraft on it to New Orleans, where there's a lot more money to be made. The bean counters won't be unhappy with this. It's not obviously a financial decision to do this, but February, aside from the time of the Chinese New Year, of course, which very famously was on last week, is not a time to make money on the Chinese routes. They've suspended until February the 29th, and then we'll all take a look at it again. The Irish Department of Foreign Affairs have not had the same elevated risk announcement for China. Basically, Sean, there are 4 levels of risk. There's a basic, it's okay to go. There's a caution risk. That's where China is, as far as Ireland is concerned. It puts it on a par with, for instance, the Middle East countries, Turkey, places like that. And then the more elevated risk is all but unnecessary travel. That's the 3rd level up. And that's what Britain has done this morning. They've placed China in that band. Ireland hasn't done so as yet. So Irish citizens don't have the same level of caution. That has implications for things like travel insurance.
Now, Eoghan, would we not be due to see flights from Ireland to China, some of them resuming, and then a new one coming online later on this year?
This is really in danger. We have a new service through Helsinki, through Shanghai, due to come on, but we are expecting the return, as it stands, of Cathay Pacific service to Hong Kong. Cathay will be doing a lot of meetings this week. There are other pressures and dynamics within the Cathay Pacific group. So the big question is, will that Cathay Pacific Dublin Hong Kong route return? No news on it yet. It is still due to return, but all of these add a little bit of pressure. I fear most for the 2 Hainan routes. We had Shenzhen, which had very low load factors, and Beijing, which was more successful for 2 summers, but it doesn't look like they will be returning. And the whole narrative around coronavirus makes any sort of expansion of air services look unlikely. The quarantine story that you've just announced in breaking, Australia have also announced a quarantine for their citizens. They are confined, though. This is important to people who've been to the city of Wuhan.
And I suppose, Eoghan, when airlines start to cancel flights, I mean, it obviously will make people sit up, but I mean, is there a risk that it could lead to a certain amount of panic?
Absolutely. I was witness to this myself, Sean, in 2009. I was in Mexico during the big H1N1 crisis there, when listeners of a certain age will remember it looked like the world was going to end, and the 24-hour news channels were carrying the story incessantly. I was actually in Mexico, which is a huge country where there was very little real impact on the ground, but what was an impact, and I was at a major conference where people were trying to return to their countries, was that airlines one by one cancelled the services. So there is a sense of we don't have the plague with people going around with bells and unclean around their necks anymore. But the aviation industry they are always wary of the litigation and the economic impact of what their passengers do. So you can find countries cut off, and that is probably sometimes a bigger economic impact than the virus itself. We saw that in Eastern Africa with the Ebola crisis, where all the international services, except for the Brussels Airlines, to their credit, Brussels Airlines continue to fly, were cut off to 3 very poor Western African countries. The economic impact was devastating. It won't be the same for China. It's a very strong, vibrant economy, but China's trading with the rest of the world is already under pressure from the tariff wars that Donald Trump initiated, and cutting off contact and reducing air services will not help. I would expect the Chinese airlines to continue, and I'd expect most of the European airlines to continue, but the news from British Airways this morning, they're suspending their 2 services, sets a very bad precedent.
Oh, and I gather you've been to Wuhan yourself in the past. What sort of a place is it? How does it compare, say, to a city like Beijing?
It's wonderful. It's a city very, very different from Beijing. It's sited on the Yangtze River, and most of what would be happening tourism-wise would be those terrific Yangtze cruises, which we all did, particularly in the days before the Three Gorges Dam was open. And but like you get a bit of figure fatigue every time you go to China. The numbers are enormous, and the infrastructure that was built at a very, very short notice over a period of 15, 20 years is absolutely, it's eye-watering. The motorways, rail systems, everything that they put in place. Wuhan is one of the top 5 cities, so it's not an insignificant city, and the province, the population in the province is, again, figure fatigue stuff. It's absolutely enormous. The notion of shutting down a city of that size, several times the population of Ireland, is quite extraordinary. I've also, Sean, eaten a snake, or eaten the snake soup that they serve, and some of the coronavirus groupies that have tracking this from the start will know that it's been the probable cause, or the suspected cause of the virus was a game market where they the bandit crate, one of the snakes there. It's a long time ago, so people don't need to avoid me if they meet me in the street.
Yes, so it's just one of those places, I suppose, as you say, the Chinese have a great capacity to expand things. We saw those huge earth movers moving across a huge site to build a hospital to deal with this. I'm not sure whether it's going to be prefab or what it is, but they're going to get it done in short order. They were moving around that site, something like ants, on a small piece of earth.
I don't think the team from the National Children's Hospital will be flying out to Wuhan anytime soon.
OK, and just to finish this just in from the Department of Foreign Affairs here in Dublin, the Department of Foreign Affairs is now advising Irish citizens to avoid all non-essential travel to China. We'll leave it there for now. Perhaps we'll get an update a little later. We did look for the Irish ambassador. We looked for an interview with the Irish ambassador in Beijing, but he just hasn't been available to us so far, at least. And thank you indeed. We'll be talking about congestion much closer to home in the capital city of Dublin after this break.
Today with Sean O'Rourke on RTE Radio 1.